Welcome to another Q&A, which will last an hour. We have a lot of questions. I think we'll focus on what's happening in the Middle East. So let's begin. This is from Mark Colson. Given Israeli history as written by Halidi, Papi, Finkelstein, Levy, and the Zionist view of Palestinians as inferior human beings, is there any evidence whatsoever that Israeli government public ever seriously entertained a two-state solution? Well, that's a good question, because I would answer yes. I would say that the liberal Zionists, people like Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres, they did envision a two-state solution, but it was not two states that were co-equals. They would always control the borders, which of course immediately denudes the power of any Palestinian state. And what they wanted was to create in the Palestine Authority a quisling government so that they could withdraw and security would be maintained by Palestinians who in essence did Israeli bidding. I knew Arafat. I interviewed him many, many times. And although the Oslo Agreement or Oslo Accords were a disaster for the Palestinians, especially because Arafat gave up the right of return. Remember, almost everyone, over 3/4 of the people in Gaza, are either displaced from historic Palestine or the descendants of those who were displaced from historic Palestine, which of course then led to the rise of Hamas as a resistance organization. So we should remember that Hamas began as a charitable organization, much like the Muslim Brotherhood. And when I was in Gaza, it ran all sorts of food banks and clinics and stuff like this. So Arafat finally wasn't willing to be obsequious enough to the Israelis, and there's pretty strong evidence that he was poisoned to death. I think many of us who covered Arafat and covered it at that time believe he was poisoned to death. I don't think we finally have any kind of proof, but and now they have Mahmoud Abbas and the PA, which is reviled in the West Bank and was expelled from Gaza because it is a tool of Israel. It suppresses all protests, all demonstrations. So on the one hand, yes, there was a vision of a two-state solution on the part of liberal Zionists. On the other hand, it was a state where Palestinians would never have real independence or real freedom. This is from John Mankin. Do you see a shift now in the messaging coming out of Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Qatar towards Israel's brutality in Lebanon and Gaza and Israel's threats to Iran, or is it only rhetoric? So you have to begin with the understanding that the Jordanian, the Hashemite rulers in Jordan, the Sisi government in Egypt, the Saudis, there's a great deal of animosity towards Hamas. And in particular, that stretches back because Hamas comes out of the Muslim Brotherhood. I knew Abdulaziz Rantisi, one of the co-founders of Hamas, in his home, had dinner with him. And he, a brilliant man, actually, not kind of the caricature in any way of what the Israelis make Hamas out to be. He was a pediatrician. He graduated first in his class from the University of Alexandria. But he was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And so the fact is there's a lot of coordination, in particular between Jordan and Egypt and Israel, because they have a common enemy, which is Hamas. Now, on the street, both within Jordan, and I was in Jordan this summer. My next book will be with Joe Sacco on Gaza. So I studied Arabic in Jerusalem and Cairo, but that That was 30 years ago. So I'm trying to bring it back. So I went to Jordan and did 80 hours of intensive Arabic. And certainly on the street in Jordan, there's strong support for Hamas and a deep anger at King Abdullah. In fact, there were weekly demonstrations outside the Israeli embassy, which is empty. The Israelis have evacuated the embassy, and crowds were chanting, "We are all Hamas," and then they were also chanting for Abdullah's half brother Faisal, who is under house arrest, to remove Abdullah. And there's a very courageous journalist in Jordan who's spending a year in prison because she wrote an article on a Lebanese website that named the company. So what happened with Yemen blocking or disrupting maritime traffic is that the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan created a land corridor that funnels Israeli goods, consumer goods, everything else over the King Hussein Bridge in through the West Bank into Israel, vegetables, all sorts of stuff. And she exposed the companies in Jordan that were doing it and the products, and they put her into prison for a year. I actually tried to visit her while I was there. I did fill out all the requisite forms, but ended up sitting outside the prison all day. So these Arab regimes, especially in Egypt and Jordan, are very fragile. Sisi has prevented any public protest because, of course, that very swiftly morphs into an anti-regime protest. Last November, I was in Egypt. The Egyptian press syndicate, and I should say there are many courageous Egyptian journalists, 22 of whom are now sitting in prison, but they had called for international press to go to Rafah, that's the border city with Egypt and Gaza, to protest the exclusion of the foreign press, Israel's exclusion of the foreign press, and a ceasefire. We never got out of Cairo. We were all arrested and thrown into a jail cell. And they were, it was interesting that the Egyptian police were especially vicious towards the Arab journalists. I mean, beating some, and they were also, the questioning revolved around one theme, which is your mother Palestinian? Is your father Palestinian? Do you have any Palestinian descent at all? So these regimes are fragile. The economy in Egypt is catastrophic. This has become their collaboration, in essence, with Israel, with the United States. It's highly unpopular. So rhetorically, Abdullah's speech at the UN was censorious of Israel. The Sisi government in Egypt has signed on to the International Court of Justice genocidal case as a full partner, but this is rhetorical. I mean, what's interesting, of course, what Israel wants to do is ethnically cleanse Gaza, to push the Palestinians out of Gaza. And originally Blinken, who was fast becoming a candidate for the worst Secretary of State in American history, went around trying to lobby the Egyptian government, the Jordanian government, the Iraqi government to accept certain numbers of quotas. I think it was a 1.1 million Palestinians being pushed into the Sinai. And it was the Egyptian military that told Sisi absolutely. I mean, Sisi is very corrupt and pliable with money and everything else. And the Egyptian government's $160 billion in debt. So I'm sure the United States was dangling the possibility of repayment of significant amounts of that debt. But the Egyptian military, this is according to friends of mine who cover this in Egypt, just was categorical that we will never happen. So, these governments rhetorically will condemn Israel for its aggressive posturing in Lebanon and for the genocide in Gaza, but in fact are collaborating with Israel and the U.S. So this is from Kevin uh, Cotuas. Would you agree that politics is downstream from culture? And if that's the case, wouldn't a counterculture movement without the arts, philosophy, spirituality be our best vehicle for change? Well, culture is absolutely a vital element in any radical or revolutionary movement. But um, I don't know that it can be divorced from uh, a political movement. I think that in a time of upheaval, as Emma Goldman said, uh, art uh, makes ideas felt. And there's always that joke about the left having the best songs. So yeah, I think that culture is extremely important, which is why repressive societies go after cultural institutions that to make ideas felt. It's why artists are targeted in the same way that serious and good journalists are. But I don't think it's either or. I think that one needs both that cultural element. I mean, I was a kid in the 1960s, but my father was very involved in the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, and there you saw how vital culture, music, theater, art, poetry, all of that was to these organizations and movements, popular movements that arose, because it wasn't just the anti-war movement. You had the American Indian movement, you had the women's movement, you had a variety, or the first Earth Day was, which was organized by Ralph Nader. So yeah, I think that no serious or radical movement can perpetuate itself without a strong cultural arm, and that's been true in revolutionary movements throughout history, always. But I don't know that you can have one without the other. This is Ultan Murphy. If our politicians and their foreign policy emerges from the shadow side of our psychology, their psychopathy being our own self-interest that we hide from ourselves, what is the one most effective thing we can do to fight this? Well, so it's their self-interest, not ours. Um, for instance, that half of all discretionary spending is poured down a military rat hole, while our trains don't function and our schools collapse and our infrastructure, our bridges decay, and uh, so it's their self-interest. Uh, they don't watch out for our self-interest. That's the game that they play. And yes, people who are attracted to power have, this is not an original idea, the traits of psychopaths. So that's penchant for violence, the capacity to lie and be believed, uh, the lack of any kind of remorse. I mean, these are the kind of figures. There's a wonderful line in Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies, where he said, the question is not how do we get good people to rule. That's the wrong question. Popper writes, most people attracted to power are at best mediocrities, and usually venal. The question is, how do we stop the powerful from inflicting as much damage as possible? That's the question. Also, the point that Max Weber writes in his book Politics as a Vocation. So, uh, yeah, they're not the game that they play is that they watch out for their self-interest, when in fact, of course, in the corporate, what Sheldon Woolen calls our system of inverted totalitarianism, the only interest they watch out for are themselves. I mean, these politicians, Obama, Clinton, I mean, they walk away, they come into the White House with relatively meager assets and walk away with millions. And I think Obama has 3 mansions. And I mean, the last president who didn't profit off of the office was Jimmy Carter. Yeah, they don't. They have all the characteristics you describe, Um, and that's why power, and that is just endemic to power. Whoever uh, wields power in whatever name of whatever ideology, these people always have to be kept in check by popular movements. This is Max Weber's point. And once those popular movements, and especially labor unions, but once, or in a free and functioning press, I mean, once these forces that keep power in check are denuded or destroyed, then power becomes extremely rapacious and increasingly totalitarian. And that's, of course, where we are. This is Kayara, who thanks me for my excellent, important word. Thank you. Was the coup against Morsi, the bombing of Al Jazeera building, assassination of Shireen Abu Akleh, preparation for Gaza genocide? I don't think it was preparation for the Gaza genocide, um, but ever since the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, we have seen the intent has always been the same, which is ethnic cleansing, removing this theft of Palestinian land. And so in moments of crisis, that would be 1948 or war, 1948, 1967, those are the periods when you had the largest numbers of Palestinians ethnically cleansed from their land. 750,000 in 1948. I think it's about 350,000 during the 1967 war. You saw Israel occupy the last 22% of land in the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan Heights that were left to the Palestinians. And now, in these periods between war, you have ethnic cleansing, but not on that scale. So there's still dispossession of land, still ethnic cleansing, but it's more like a slow motion ethnic cleansing. Now that we have the conflict in Gaza and the conflict in Lebanon, what you'll see, especially because people will be distracted, is an acceleration of that project. We're already seeing it in the West Bank. There was a bombing, I think it was in Tulkarm, by fighter jets, Israeli fighter jets, um, today. The settlers, which have been armed by this right wing government, being given assault weapons, essentially are functioning as rogue militias, with stealing larger and larger segments of Palestinian land, terrorizing Palestinians. So that's what always happens when there's a conflict. That campaign to remove Palestinians physically and to possess their land is always accelerated, and that's what we're watching right now. Of course, Gaza has been physically destroyed. The intent of Israel is to push the Palestinians out of Gaza. I think they've already made it clear that Israel intends to occupy northern Gaza, and it's of course off the coast of northern Gaza that you have the oil, the natural gas fields that Israel wants to exploit. And then you push 2.3 million people into the south where they have neither clean water or adequate living conditions or health services or adequate food. And you create a humanitarian crisis that is just so catastrophic that I think Israel hopes that humanitarian crisis will eventually create a situation by which they can push those people out. And of course, when your children are dying and when you don't have enough to eat and people are infectious disease are rampant, we've already seen cases of polio, then they'll leave. I mean, there's only so much people can take. That's Israel's intent. But right now, they have nowhere to push them to. That's the issue. From your experience as a war correspondent, what do you think has made the IDF so shockingly brutal, especially against Palestinian children? Well, I wouldn't say that they're shockingly brutal compared to the other conflicts that I covered. Remember, I covered the war in the former Yugoslavia. When I first got to El Salvador in the early 80s, the death squads were killing between 700 and 1,000 people a month. And those victims, who were largely student leaders, labor leaders, church lay workers, journalists, were terribly mutilated. I mean, they weren't content just to shoot them, but they were, uh, I mean, I won't go into graphic detail, but they hated us as journalists, and of 22 journalists were killed during that war, foreign journalists, and they had a clandestine right-wing radio station where they would issue death threats. When you cover a war, you try only and covered in daylight hours, and we all worked out of the Camino Real Hotel in San Salvador, and you don't go into a conflict zone alone. And so we would meet in the parking lot at dawn. The same was true in Sarajevo. You did not want to be out after dark. In fact, in Central America, if we were caught out on a road, and it would sometimes happen we couldn't get back, we would turn the lights on inside our car so that hopefully anybody was going to shoot up the car would realize that we were journalists, we were foreigners, they could see us. So they had a clandestine radio station from the right wing, from the death squads, who, by the way, had a lot of Israeli weapons. And we came to work one day, and they had taken 3 campesinos and killed them, slit their throats, and cut off their genitals and stuffed them in their mouths, and left us a message that we were next. I'm sure these people were completely innocent of anything, probably any political activity, but they were used as a kind of calling card. So, I mean, look, Bosnia, I went into villages where the Serbs had taken Muslims and crucified on the sides of barns. So I don't think the IDF is any less brutal than the other conflicts that I covered. Once you dehumanize human beings, I mean, once you don't see them as human beings like you, but as animals or as an embodiment of evil, that have to be eradicated in order to make the world a better place, then anything becomes possible. And that is, of course, precisely how the IDF views the Palestinians. But that savagery is not unique, unfortunately, to Israel. So like Israel, America was, I'm not sure who asked this, but like Israel, America was also founded on genocide, yet not many people are arguing to give the natives their land back. What is the difference on the ground between American and Palestine? Is it simply that the genocide by the Israelis is more recent and thus not too late to stop? Well, yes, of course. We are a settler colonial project. We were founded on genocide. And I think that explains part of the affinity the American hierarchy has towards Israel. But there's a difference. And the difference is that we killed. We killed 90% of indigenous Americans. And genocide will work. Settler colonial projects will work when you eradicate the indigenous population. That's what the Argentines did, for instance, in the occupation of Argentina. Israel will never be able to kill 90% of the Palestinians, partly because you have, I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but I think it's 9 million in the diaspora. They can't kill on that scale. And that's what makes their genocidal project and their apartheid state so fragile. So yes, unfortunately, I mean, you look at what the Turks did to the Armenians. When you are willing to kill, close to 100% of the population, then genocide as a tactic to seize land and dispossess and erase a people can work. But I don't see how Israel is going to be able to kill on that scale. Was Israel, this is from Bogey 708. Okay. Was Israel dead from its conception? Can you build something lasting founded on a victim mentality with no conscience? Yeah. I mean, Israel was dead from its conception because, of course, it was a theocratic state. It was an apartheid state. It was a racist state. It was never meant to be a democracy. It certainly, or if it was a democracy, it was only for Jews. And the Yeshayahu Leibowitz, this great Israeli philosopher, I think died in the 90s, he wrote about this and warned about how, when you occupy a people, you create internal systems of control for the occupied, which includes secret police, militarized police, special courts, informants, a vast spy network that ultimately becomes a cancer or poison within your own society. He had a line in there that, if that occupation followed its natural course, Israel would no longer exist and no longer, or no longer exist and no longer be worth defending. I'm probably mangling the quote a little bit. So yes, it was. Oh, and we saw from Ben Gurion's private correspondence, you had Jabotinsky, who Mussolini called a good fascist, and he was an early Zionist, but quite explicit about the removal of the Palestinians to create a quote unquote ethnically pure state. And Ben Gurion, who was in name a socialist, they came out of that wing of liberal Zionism and spoke differently. But we know from his private letters he also knew very well that uh, that the Palestinians were to be removed, erased, dispossessed. I mean, it's quite, having lived in Israel and having worked a lot in southeastern Turkey, it's just eerie to go into these places where you can see the remains of entire villages that have just been written out of history. The official narrative of Turkey, or the official narrative of Israel. This is from Sam K. Sources are saying that Israel bombed Russia's weapons depot in Syria at their base. If true, would the Russians respond in any way? How long do you think the King of Jordan will be in power? I've heard those reports, of course. I don't think they're confirmed. I might be wrong. Um, I think the Russians, the Chinese, they will do what they can to help Iran. Iran is crippled in the fact that its air power is very weak. Its fighter jets are, some of them date from the time of the Shah, who was, of course, overthrown in 1979. Um, uh, I don't think any of them actively want to be involved in a conflict in the Middle East, but certainly they will uh, do what they can, uh, uh, probably clandestinely, to support Iran. Uh, Israel, I think we're headed for a direct conflict between Iran and Israel. Um, the big question is, of course, the inception of that conflict will be aerial. They will be trying to take out uh, military facilities, intelligence. I'm talking about the Israelis, intelligence facilities, any nuclear facilities, although some of those facilities, I understand, are buried very deep within mountains, and I don't know whether they have the ordnance to destroy them or not. But anyway, the first phase will be aerial, but it could all go really, really bad, um, especially if you have Iran in alliance with Hezbollah and Lebanon beginning to drop significant ordnance on Israel itself. And I know that in the past, Hezbollah has singled out the big chlorine factory, which is outside of Tel Aviv, which, if they hit it, would send out noxious, toxic gas. Um, so, all of us who cover the Middle East are extremely worried about how close to the precipice we stand. This is from Chinchilla. Is Israel driving U.S. policy, or it is the other way around? Are we in a toxic relationship death spiral? Yeah, we're in a toxic relationship death spiral because Israel owns the Congress. There any kind of restraint. I think there is pretty clear evidence that certainly the Pentagon. I know that Lloyd Austin was quite angry because the Pentagon was not informed until, almost on the eve of the assassination of Nasrallah, not informed about the incursion in Lebanon. Um, but it doesn't matter uh, because the Israel lobby has so much money, and because they use that money. I mean, would they spend $15 million to defeat Jamal Bowman? I think because they use that money to essentially, in our system of legalized bribery, to buy up, in particular, the Congress. They can do anything that they want, and that I know there's always been a great deal of resistance within the Pentagon to a war with Iran for probably what should be obvious reasons. And that's what Netanyahu wants. He wants to drag the United States into a conflict where it obliterates Iran, bombs Iran, degrades Iran the way we degraded Saddam Hussein, who was seen as a threat and a counterweight within, which he was, within the region to the Zionist state. It didn't go very well for the U.S. I mean, Iran is now, or Iraq is now a Shia country allied with Iran. So, yeah, if the assault, if any assault, is sustained and begins to, in a serious way, damage Israel, and that would be from Iran and Hezbollah, then there will the loyal Zionist paid for politicians in the Congress will. I mean, would they just give Israel another $8.5 billion or something in arms? They could drag us into a war, which would be utterly catastrophic. Iran is not a threat to us, has not threatened us. Of course, neither did Iraq. Fabio de Oliveira Ribeiro, frustrated by their defeat at Stalingrad, unable to stop the Red Army, the Nazis accelerated the final solution from 1943 onwards. Will the Zionists accelerate the Holocaust of the Palestinians? Yeah. I mean, in a way, Lebanon and a conflict with Iran provides the perfect cover. You've had 6 schools in Gaza bombed in the last few days. And of course, they want the world's attention to be diverted. And that will give them an even freer hand to decimate Gaza, and let's not forget the West Bank, to carry out as I said, there was an airstrike today in the West Bank. Remember, these are airstrikes against refugee camps. If the U.S. Middle East proxy wars come to an end through a forced ceasefire, do you expect the ruling elite to bring the war home? What's in store for Americans? This is from Michael Castaneda. I don't see that a ceasefire is viable because as long as the U.S. continues to provide the weapons, and Kamala Harris and Trump, will certainly keep those floodgates open, I don't envision a ceasefire. What I envision is a long-term occupation of certainly southern Lebanon and Gaza. Now, over the long term, if you go back to 1982, or if you go back to 2006 when Israel invaded Lebanon, over the long term, those wars of attrition don't tend to go very well for Israel. In 2006, you could argue that the Israelis were pushed out. I mean, at best, it was a stalemate. They were probably pushed out. And they've not defeated Hamas. They've certainly hurt and degraded Hamas, but they've yet to defeat Hamas. I think many of us who have spent a lot of time in the Middle East think this is, going to be a kind of forever war, both in Gaza and in Lebanon. I mean, the wild card is what Iran does. I mean, I think it's pretty clear Israel's going to strike Iran. And then, what will be Iran's response? How heavy will it be? Those are unknowns. This is Mephiles. From your experience, how could we encourage countries into collaboration and dialogue for solving problems? It seems the Gulf countries are doing that, but people are too toxic to them everywhere. Well, I think the big problem is the arms industry. When you flood these countries with weapons, and you hand them to dictators like Sisi, then or the Zionists or the Saudis or anyone else. I mean, these people have very little popular support within their own countries, but they have massive amounts of weaponry in term, especially, and of course, surveillance help and everything else, which they will turn on their own people and use for internal control. And I think I would say the two problems are the despotic regimes themselves. When I was in Cairo recently, I was with the former Minister of Information for Gamal Abdel Nasser, who Sadat had thrown in prison for 10 years after Nasser died. And he said to me, Israel's able to do what it does, not because it's strong, but because the Arab countries are weak. And I thought that was a really prescient point. These figures like Abdallah or Sisi or the Saudi royal family, they are largely despised within their own countries because of their collaboration. I mean, Jordan was shooting down missiles, of course, both times on their way into Israel. And if you go back to the old non-aligned movement with Nehru and Tito and Nasser, there you actually had a kind of a power center, that non-aligned power center that I think would make it much harder for Israel to carry out the genocide that it's carrying out. But basically, within the Arab world, they've sold the Palestinians out. That's not new. They've sold the Palestinians out for decades, and every Palestinian will, tell you that. This is from Chris Agnos. Can you speak to the history of Iran in the 50s when there used to be a democratic secular society and the CIA overthrew them? Doesn't that show the whole idea of promoting to be democracy to be a farce? Yes. Well, I mean, look, I was 20 years overseas. I heard that rhetoric in every country I was in. The last thing the U.S. imperial power wanted, whether it was in Iraq or Iran or anywhere else, was a democracy. And of course, you're referring to the overthrow of Mossadegh, which was orchestrated by the British intelligence and the CIA, in particular Kermit Roosevelt, because he wanted you had British Petroleum, which was stealing Iranian oil. The Iranians didn't even know how much oil was being taken out of their own country. They wanted control of their own resources. Mossadegh was no flaming radical, and that was too much for the CIA and the British. And so they had him overthrown and propped up the dictatorship of the Shah, which, of course, led to the 1979 revolution and the Islamic Republic of Iran. So, but it's not just Iran. Lebanon, certainly before 48, there were powerful democratic movements. But what happened with the creation of the Zionist state is that it empowered the militarists within the Arab world who made alliances with Western powers. That was not true under Nasser, by the way. But we've crushed one democratic movement after another because Hamas was elected. Hamas was voted into office, and those elections were sponsored, or if sponsored, certainly encouraged by the U.S. And then when the Palestinian Authority didn't win, Hillary Clinton and others, aggressively moved to take Hamas out. There was actually an attempted coup d'etat, which didn't work. It drove the PA out of Gaza. So, we don't mind elections as long as you put our candidates in power. And if it doesn't work out that our puppets are in power, then we will crush the democratic aspirations of the democratic movements that oppose us. I mean, the great example of this is Lumumba in the Congo. And what happened to Lumumba? I mean, with the CIA assistance, although it was primarily the French intelligence services, he was assassinated, and they installed Mobutu, who was, corrupt and a tool of Western interests, and in particular the CIA. This is from Maria VM. What is the one thing that might keep the world from yet another world war? Well, a functioning U.S. policy that stopped arming Israel, because as long as we funnel these weapons into Israel, Israel can continue its expanding aggression against the Palestinians, against Lebanon, against Syria, and against Iran, which has the potential to provoke certainly a regional war. And then there's always the question of nuclear. Israel, of course, is a nuclear power, but it is believed that Iran, if it wants to, is only weeks away from creating nuclear weapons. And I mean, it's so horrifying. It's almost beyond the realm of comprehension. So this is from Gray Dove. Hypothetically, if Iran did strike, would the U.S. response escalate similar to Russia and Ukraine, where the U.S. sends equipment, or can you see a draft? Well, that's a really interesting question. So John Mearsheimer, whose work I respect tremendously, has been talking about a direct confrontation with Iran, which would potentially force the United States to create a draft. I don't know. I mean, we're really in the realm of speculation. What's not speculation is certainly there will be an aerial assault, and they will attempt to degrade Iran through repeated airstrikes, as they did in Lebanon. I mean, there's no electricity in Beirut. Whether that, I mean, I wonder what the staging area would be, because in essence, the Iraqi government is Shia. Shiites, Iran is a Shia country. 60% of Iraq is Shia. I don't know. I mean, those are, but I mean, boy, I take Mearsheimer very, very seriously, and that is an issue that he has raised. But he also said that if that were to happen, and essentially, drafting, he raises the number of 1 million young people to go to war with Iran would create civil unrest. I think that is also very true, because it's just essentially a proxy war on behalf of Israel. There's no reason for us to go to war with Iran. Lori Lamoth, how do you see the next moves playing out? Will Iran take out Israel's airfields in a larger attack? What would the response be, and where does it go next? Well, I mean, the next step is an Israeli strike. How massive, what they strike, those again, I mean, I'm guessing if the strike is massive, Iran has already said that it would respond. Yes, they would try and take out military installations. They targeted the Mossad headquarters. They targeted airfields in the last strike. So, yeah, that would, and certainly it would be coordinated with Hezbollah. But how big, how effective, you know, after an Israeli strike, I think that the Iranian strikes have been relatively restrained, because I think Iran does not want to drag itself into a war. But look, once I covered a lot of war. Once it starts, war controls you. You don't control it. And then there's just so many ways that it can go really wrong, and really badly, and you lose control, even when the policies that you have to enact, openly are not in your own self-interest. Barbara Tuchman writes about this in The Guns of August, on World War One. This is from Roy. Why is the UN incapable of holding Israel accountable in a substantive way, given that the UN in part played a role in establishing Israel? Is it possible they are beholden to corporate power and the military-industrial complex, like the governments they are meant to hold accountable? Well, most countries in the UN openly oppose the genocide, and a significant number of the representatives in the UN walked out of when Netanyahu spoke. They can't control the actions of Israel for two reasons. One, they don't have any mechanism militarily or economically to control Israel, and two, because of the structure of the Security Council, the United States vetoes any resolution that is unpalatable to Israel. So, I mean, look, I saw the UN at work, UNRWA, and all these organizations, the UNICEF and the World Food Program, and all that stuff, and and they did great work in war zones. They were pretty useless as peacekeepers during the war in Bosnia, because they just don't have the military capability, and perhaps more importantly, the military authority to aggressively go after perpetrators of uh, of genocide. So after, for instance, the Srebrenica massacre, and I was in Bosnia for that, uh, the NATO planes began to bomb Serbian positions, that gun emplacements. And so in Sarajevo, we were surrounded by Serb forces who occupied the hills above the city, and they used very heavy weapons, or the equivalent of 155 howitzers. These are very large artillery pieces, Katyusha rockets. um, and the Serbs had essentially placed tanks, old T-72 Soviet tanks, Russia tanks, and used them as artillery pieces. So they were lobbing 90 millimeter tank shells into the city through about 300 to 400 a day. Well, the NATO planes took all of that out, took out the arms depots, and that again was aerial. But once the heavy artillery was removed uh, from the Serbian arsenal, then the Bosniak Muslims, who didn't have any heavy weapons, were really able to roll back the Serbs. And I was in that final push where we were moving on the Serb town of Banja Luka. And there was a fear in both Belgrade and Washington that Bosnia would be ethnically cleansed of Serbs, because the Serbs were fleeing as we advanced on Banja Luka. We had Croatian artillery backing us up. And outside of Banja Luka, we woke up one morning, and in some sleazy deal between Belgrade and Washington, all the Croatian artillery had been removed, and they had green-lighted the Serbs to attack us with MiGs. It was the only time I've been attacked by I was attacked by helicopters in the war in Salvador, and I was with the FMLN, but I'd never been attacked by fighter jets. And you don't hear them. They're so fast. The concussion or the explosion is the first thing you hear. And I'll always remember turning on the BBC, and I hear the UN spokespeople saying that they couldn't confirm that Belgrade was using MiGs. And we, of course, at that point, were rolled back and stopped, which is what they wanted. So if there's one lesson I take as a former foreign correspondent or war correspondent, is that especially in a proxy war, they will sell you out as fast as they can, which of course I covered the Kurds, and that's the history of the Kurds. This is from Terra Viva Solutions. How are the people in Gaza surviving with the border crossings all closed? At least some food must be coming in, or is starvation just not being reported? Well, first of all, the reporting has been degraded, because over 116 Palestinian journalists and media workers have been killed, many are targeted and assassinated. So we're not getting the kinds of reporting that we should. But there are cases of starvation. A trickle of food comes in, not much. Certainly not enough to sustain Gaza. So yeah, people are certainly going hungry. And that's part of course, any policy of genocide is to deny food along with everything else. But food is an elemental tool in terms of destroying the viability of any targeted population. This is Zan Stewart. Is there any evidence that Hamas uses human shields, as Israel has long stated? There's no question that Hamas will set up, rockets and stuff like this in densely populated areas. I know that from Palestinian friends. I mean, some of whom left. A couple of my friends were in Gaza and got out, Palestinians. And they did see this on the one hand. On the other hand, Gaza is so densely populated, especially with everybody now pushed into the south, that I don't know where you could go to set up a rocket launcher and not have people around it. In terms of human shields, I've never seen. I mean, when I reported there, the Israelis use human shields all the time. They will force Palestinians to stand by windows and fire behind them. They will get Palestinians to walk in front of their jeeps. They will handcuff Palestinians and put them in Israeli uniforms and make them walk down into the tunnels in advance of Israeli troops. The use of human shields by the Israeli army is ubiquitous and well documented. I have not, I mean, it may have happened, but I've never seen credible evidence that Hamas uses Palestinians as human shields. Although, I suppose if you're setting up a rocket launcher in a densely populated area, maybe that becomes a species of, human shields. I don't know. Sandy Galbraith, war reporting is opaque, but in Israel, defeat is painted as victory. Winners or losers and clear events are said to have not occurred. What's your view? Well, that's true for us. It's true for everybody. Any country that goes to war, the press immediately does its patriotic duty to cheerlead the war and turn, as you point out, defeat into victory. Boy, that's what we did in Afghanistan. That's what we did in Iraq. That's what we did in Libya. That's what we did in Vietnam. So in that sense, Israel's not unique. Martin O'Connor, can you discuss the change of relationship between the U.S. and Israel when Kennedy came to the White House as he broke arms embargoes, providing Ben Gurion with Hawk missiles, Truman, Eisenhower wouldn't? Yeah, I mean, Eisenhower was probably the most aggressive in terms of curbing Israel's imperial projects. Remember, 1956, you had Britain, France, and Israel, after Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, they invaded Gaza for 100 days and, of course, executed large numbers of men and boys. And Abdulaziz Rantisi, who I mentioned before, the co-founder of Hamas, was 10 years old, living in Han Yunis, and saw his uncle and many other people from Han Yunis lined up against a wall and killed. And that was a moment that radicalized him. I mean, even when he would speak to me about it, he got extremely emotional. So yeah, Eisenhower finally pulled the plug and told the Israelis they had to stop. But I'd be hard pressed. I mean, the first George W. Bush, remember they had sanctions. I think it was a $10 billion loan that they put on hold because they were trying to stop settlement development in the West Bank. And I guess at that point, Gaza. But yeah, I mean, those are, and Bush, the first Bush, Herbert Walker Bush was a one-term president, and that was an experience not lost on his son, who gave Israel everything they wanted. John Henderson, where do you think the line lies between Netanyahu going beyond what U.S. warmongers want and giving the imperialists the exact opportunities? He's already gone beyond what they want. They don't want a regional war. They don't want him to invade Lebanon. They would like to orchestrate some kind of a ceasefire to tamper down the conflict. They're not relishing a conflict with Iran, but Netanyahu can operate with complete impunity because of the power of the Israel lobby. Jules T., how long do you give the American empires Israel on borrowed time? I mean, no empire lasts forever. History shows you that. I think what Israel is doing is extremely dangerous in terms of its own long-term viability. I mean, the moment the United States pulls away from Israel and is no longer willing to back it up, including to go to war on its behalf, then I think Israel becomes very vulnerable. But, I learned as a reporter that while we can read these signs, when we have a sense, I mean, all of us knew, for instance, that the Palestinian population was very restive. None of us predicted the first Intifada or the second Intifada. These moments of eruption are very hard to predict. But yeah, I think that when we explain the trajectory of both Israel and the American empire, not only are they in decline, but this military adventurism, which always characterized late empires. So early empires are very judicious, which was also true with Israel about the use of military force, how they used it. Late empires, as they lose their hegemony or control, this is certainly the story of the American empire, but not unique to the American empire, then they begin to engage in military adventurism to seek to recapture that lost hegemony, but it becomes counterproductive. So 20 years of debacles and fiascos in the Middle East. We can go all the way back to Vietnam. And of course, none of the people who led, promoted, and orchestrated these fiascos are held accountable. That's also a product of late M. In fact, they're all promoted and, perpetuating. I mean, Ukraine is a lost cause. So, yeah, but in terms of putting a time frame on it, I think that is impossible to do. So we'll do one more question. So this is a question from Kiara. Why do the neocons want a Middle East war so much? So the neocons, the very warped and distorted world vision of the neocons dovetails completely with that of the Zionists, which is the rest of the world only understands violence, especially brown and people of color, who there's a strong element of white supremacy and racism. Remember, the mantra went that with the invasion of Iraq, the people would rise up and support us. The oil would pay for the reconstruction, so it wouldn't cost the American taxpayer any money. And democracy would emanate outwards from Baghdad throughout the Middle East, in particular Iran. None of that was a non-reality based belief system. So I think both the Zionists and the neocons have this very warped vision of how to communicate with the rest of the world, which is almost exclusively through violence. They don't understand. They're culturally, linguistically, religiously, historically illiterate. They certainly don't understand the Muslim world, and so therefore they engage in these utopian projects. I mean, I use the word the way Thomas More meant it to be used. Quite literally, it meant no place. It's not grounded in any kind of a reality. I think what the Zionists are doing, the Zionist state of Israel is doing, is not grounded in reality. And I think the same is true with the neocons. And our tragedy is that the neocons who gave us Iraq and gave us Afghanistan and gave us the same people who gave us Ukraine, same people who gave us the expansion of NATO beyond the borders of a unified Germany, in open an open betrayal, because I was there in East Germany in 1989 when Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the German foreign minister, and Secretary of State James Baker made a very clear promise to Gorbachev that NATO would not be expanded, with all the consequences we know, provoking finally Putin to invade Ukraine, which isn't to excuse it. It's still a war crime, but he was provoked in the same way that Israel is provoking Iran. So these are, mediocrities is too kind a word. They're very stunted, limited people who unfortunately have corporate backing, largely from the arms industry. I mean, all these neocon think tanks are just funded by Raytheon, and because they perpetuate the arms industry and the war machine. They're the useful idiots of the war machine, but idiot is the right word. All right. Well, on that happy note, I want to thank Sophia, who's been here handling this, and Max, who's in California handling this. Boy, let's hope this doesn't go as bad as I think it might go.